Movies Till Dawn continue on Channel 5 with Island of Lost Souls.
Welcome to Movies Till Dawn, a new podcast that's a safe space for filmmakers to talk about the fascinating and exasperating and always unusual and never quite the same thing twice process of creating motion pictures. Welcome back to part 2 of my conversation with legendary writer and director John Sayles, which we recorded this year, 2019, in July in his home office in Hoboken, New Jersey. I was very privileged to get a positive response from John when I said, can we do this? Can we talk about your career? And like a lot of these conversations I'm having, they're not career-spanning interviews. We're picking certain movies to talk about. And in this episode, we talk about, among other things, John's latest movie, the 2013 crime drama, which is called Go for Sisters. Calling it a crime drama is a little reductive because, like most of John's movies, it brings up significant issues about race, social equality or inequality, and it does so within the confines of a genre movie, in this case the genre being a detective procedural. It's an unusual procedural because it centers around 2 African-American women who were so close in their teenage years that they could go for sisters, but they've since seriously diverged. One is a parole officer and the other is a criminal. They wind up joining forces to find the parole officer's missing son who's accused of murder. And along the way, they get involved in a lot of strange people, the strangest and the most interesting being a disgraced, myopic ex-cop, marvelously portrayed by Edward James Olmos. It's very unusual. It was shot pretty quickly. It's 19 days. I believe John says he had 65 locations or something insane like that. And it was made for under $1 million, and it says a lot about John's devotion to his art and his work ethic that he's still willing to go out there and do that to get his movie made. He is undaunted by circumstance, and he rolls up his sleeves and he gets to work, which is, to me, always one of the things that I find so admirable about him as a filmmaker, a writer, an artist, and something that I think people who do admire him seek to emulate. We also talk about a little bit about Matewan, his 1985 or 86 movie about the Battle of Matewan, which was a 1920 coal miners' strike in West Virginia, a very, very interesting movie. Again, a period piece shot for much less money than it looks like. What we talk about, though, is specifically the cinematographer Haskell Wexler, who shot it, and how John came to hire him. Wexler is not the easiest guy in the world to work with. He was not every director's cup of tea. He shot Mike Nichols, Who's Afraid of Virginia Woolf, Bound for Glory, Terrence Malick's Days of Heaven. He's really a legend, and how John and Haskell came to join forces in this unusual venture is really, I think, is pretty interesting. We also talk about another movie that I highly recommend, you may not have heard much about, unfortunately, called Honey Dripper. This is a movie that John made in 2007, and it's a slice of life about a small Alabama town in the early 1950s and how rock and roll comes to that town and changes it. It takes place over, I think, about 48 hours, which I love the time compression that he uses as a restriction on his storytelling in it. It's a really interesting movie, and I think you'll find our talk about it interesting. Finally, we talk about his 2010 film Amigo. And Amigo is based on a novel that John wrote called A Moment in the Sun about the Philippine-American War in 1900. Again, it's an epic, but it's an epic made for so much less money than your average 1-hour TV episode that it's kind of stunning. It's also in another language. And I don't know other directors who simply decide to learn another language and go make a movie and John will learn to speak Spanish and go make a movie in Mexico. This is the sort of mind you're dealing with. There's really no boundaries for John in terms of what he can accomplish when he chooses to, put his art first and do this work. I think I mentioned at the intro of the previous episode that John does something that is supposed to be a cardinal rule that you never do, which is spends his own money sometimes. on his movies, and he seems to do so without blinking. This is actually something that, and I'll try to keep this brief. It's something that inspired me early in my career to do the same. So I either have to thank him or blame him for this. My first feature is called Cafe Society, and it premiered at the Directors Fortnight in the Cannes Film Festival. This is in 1995 or 6, I think. And it's a pretty splashy place to premiere your movie, but we had offers on it. I think Sony Classics had made us an offer. For some reason, the deals didn't make. And ultimately, the movie did not get a theatrical release. It got sold to Showtime. And Showtime, they did a great job promoting it, and they paid us well for the movie. But I was a 30-year-old film director going, hey, wait a minute. I didn't make this movie for TV. I wanted it on major screens. So I realized I wasn't going to get it on major screens, but there was a theater near where I lived at the time in Greenwich Village called the Screening Room, and they had a wonderful cafe, and they had a nice little theater. And in a completely naive way, I just went to them and said, what would it take for me to open my movie at your theater? So they had to look at it first. They liked the movie, and they said, well, look, if you give us a minimum guarantee, we need to know that you're going to spend a certain amount on ads. We can book it for a week. We'll see how it does. We'll see how your reviews are. And I had just made some money writing a screenplay for a studio. So with John Sayles as my influence, I said, yeah, let's spend some of this money and open my movie. So I agreed to do it, and we quickly signed some papers and said, well, we'll go do this summer. And one of the things I had to do was buy an ad in the New York Times, which I never had any experience doing. So I called up and I said, how much does, I figured maybe a quarter-page size ad should do. So I said, how much for this, because I'm going to open my own movie? And the answer came back, that'll be $35,000. Which was not really what I expected. I mean, I like I say, I was naive, but I wasn't that naive. I said, I think I seem to have gotten myself kind of in the mud here, but what would the smallest ad cost? And I think ultimately I wound up writing a check for $20-some thousand, which was a pretty big chunk of the money I had just made writing a script. But then I started hunting around for other ways to advertise the film. I found out that radio ads don't cost much. I went and did, anyway, and this is also kind of pre-internet, so it was a bit of an adventure. Anyway, around that time, a friend of mine bought I guess it was Google early on, and it was pretty cheap. And later that year, it was worth 10 or 20 or 30 times more than my friend had paid for it. And I once realized that had I bought the Google instead of opened my own movie, I would have been pretty damn rich. As it was, I spent probably $50,000-$60,000 of my own money opening my movie, and it was an incredibly satisfying experience. I got a really nice New York Times review. I will say that I would never do such a thing again. I would just thank Showtime for buying my movie. But I also will thank John Sayles for being an inspiration for making me as a young filmmaker brave enough to go do something like that. Anyway, here's part 2 of my conversation with John Sayles. Yeah, my father, who's a writer, started in radio in the 40s. Uh-huh. And literally, he got home from the war. He lived with his mother in the Bronx, and he just started. And he still had this book on the shelf for years called "How to Write for Radio." Uh-huh, and he kept it around forever. And it's a great little book because here's how to do a half hour. That is essentially 3 acts jammed into into 25 minutes. And he would simply mail the scripts out. To Suspense, to Escape, to The Whistler, and they started buying them. Uh-huh. And he always said the best and worst thing that happened was The Whistler bought his first script, and he was like, "Oh, this is easy." Yeah. And then the year went by, and he wrote 20 of them, and nobody bought them, and still he was already hooked though. Yeah.
I was talking last night. I did there was a screening of 8 Men Out, and I was talking about being on Studs Terkel's show. And Studs was brilliant on the radio, but he had been a radio actor in Chicago and did dramas. And he because of his voice, he did Edward G. Robinson kind of parts. And so And he'd had a TV show or whatever, but when I started acting with him, he was in scenes with me because I was playing Ring Lardner and he was playing another sports writer.
Right.
He would say his line and then freeze. And I'd say, you don't have any more lines, Studs, but we are continuing to act here. Oh yeah, it's not radio. Yeah.
That's funny. Yeah. Well, there's also a school of acting where they used to just memorize their pages.
Yeah.
With no real context at all. And the one that I've always loved, the story is that William Frawley, as Fred Mertz, never read an I Love Lucy script and never knew why people thought it was funny. He just came in and read Fred Mertz, which maybe was why his performance was so funny.
It was his gig. It was his. It's about you. It's what I always tell guys who have a day player or 2 days or whatever is that you're not going to get that many close-ups, but this story is about you. And you have to play it that way, Liz Pena used to say, well, this is how an actor reads a script. My line, bullshit, my line. And that's, to a certain extent, maybe that's what you have to do.
Yeah.
Woody Allen, I think, famously only sent people their sides. And so it's like, what's the rest of the movie about? Well, you'll see it when it comes out.
Yeah, you'll see it later, yeah. Yeah, that's interesting. I love when a day player shows up and they've really figured it all out. They're and sometimes I find like they're really the ones who need the least direction.
Yeah, I try to give them some time because they don't know the vibe of the set yet.
Sure.
And having been a day player a lot, that's mostly what I do as an actor now, is one of the things you have to know is the minute you're done with your last line and they say, okay, print that, you're furniture. The crew doesn't even look at you. You're in the way.
Right.
And that's tough on the ego of an actor. I'm not an actor, professionally. I do it, but I've got other things that I do. But I know that it's tough on a day player because sometimes I get good people to come in and do something. And the other thing that I try to do is Chris Cooper was really helpful with this in Lone Star. Lone Star's kind of a detective story. And so there's a lot of him going in and, basically interviewing somebody about what happened in 1959. You knew my father, blah, 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 blah. So we had a lot of day players, a lot of really good day players, and we had a day to shoot them. And they might be a 5-minute, 6-minute scene, 8-minute scene. And I just say to Chris in the morning so this is not your day. The camera's going to be over your shoulder for about 3/4 of the day. And he said, yeah, I can use that. I'll practice.
That's a good thing to start the day with an actor because
just so they know.
Yeah. And so they don't feel like you're either shortchanging them or they don't feel insecure. And
yeah. Where's the rest of me? Where's the camera? I got to work with Lily Taylor once, and truly the only acting question she ever asked me is, when's lunch? And it wasn't that she didn't want to know what it was, but she had to pace herself through the day.
Right.
And like a lot of actors, like I don't like to have a full stomach when I'm acting, and so I don't like to work right after. And I said, are we going to be shooting right after lunch? And it's like, okay, I'm not going to eat very much. But she knew she had to eat at some point, or she wouldn't have the energy to do it.
So that's really what an actor's focus sometimes becomes.
No,
I literally how to pace yourself through the day.
It's about your stamina, and because I'm often working. I've shot. I think 4 of my movies have been 4-week movies. And the last one, Gopher Sisters, we shot for 4 weeks, and we had 64 locations in 2 countries, and so. What you tell the actors is you're not going to have a lot of downtime.
Right.
When you're on the set, you're going to be bum, 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 bum. So get yourself into that kind of rhythm.
Fontaine Gamble, and I'm a drug addict.
Who's your friend?
I'm Bernice Stokes. I'm not an alcoholic or a drug addict or anything. I'm a parole officer.
I had her once. She's a real ball buster.
Your son. He's a suspect.
In the murder?
I'll do what I can. But some of the people I gotta talk to, that's a violation of my parole.
Not if you inform your parole officer and get approval. I'm your parole officer.
I watched Gopher Sisters a few days ago, and it's also a detective story.
In a way,
It's a procedural. I mean, it's a good deal more, but what you have to do is introduce new and fresh characters
Yeah.
in every scene.
Yeah,
which
it's
is
a
quite
road
challenge.
movie where they're looking for somebody, and so you meet these people, and they're a step along the way. And so yeah, we had a lot of nice day players in that one. But the challenge was we were moving our base camp once a day, sometimes twice a day. And we were shooting, and 3 of the 4 weeks were in LA. We went down to Mexico for a couple days at the end of it. And they've been making feature films in LA for 110 years or whatever it is now. People are not impressed that you're shooting in their neighborhood. In fact, if you're going to shoot in front of their restaurant, they want $8,000
Right.
just for it to be in the background, And so for $1 million movie, it was just under $1 million. A third of our budget was location fees, and we were up in the deep valley where it's cheaper, and it still cost us that much.
Yeah, and it's such a wonderful seedy portrait of LA.
Yeah.
What's that motel called that she goes? It's like the Star-Kissed Motel.
Oh
or
yeah.
something. It's like,
Well, what was interesting about that motel is it's on Sepulveda, pretty far up, and we were trying to, I would say my location guy, well, here's the 3 places that I like, because I did a lot of scouting myself, and we'll just go with the cheapest one. And he said, well, this guy only rents by the hour. And so we paid him by the hour. And there were girls making phone calls there and, doing their business and everything like that. I think it was basically, a lot of trucker clientele.
right.
But that was the LA that they happened to be in, and that LA is really interesting in that way, because there really are ethnic neighborhoods, even though they're spread out, and so you don't notice it. And the Valley, you'll go to one of those little shopping malls, and there'll be a Korean restaurant next to a Filipino restaurant, next to a Mexican restaurant, next to an Armenian restaurant. And they're starting to discover each other's food, which is kind of neat, is that, oh yeah, I like that Armenian food, it's all right.
I was watching the movie thinking, you're so not a San Fernando Valley guy. Like, how did you find that? Why did you set there? Why did you? And perhaps you knew it for a long time. But...
I knew it a little bit. Some of it was just practical, which is that except for Yolanda Ross, all of my actors were there. One of my disappointments with it is that I don't like to audition people by having them put themselves on tape and say, I'd like to be in the room with them. But I didn't have the money to go out to LA and cast. And so I just knew, well, Eddie Olmos is out there. Most of my cast is LA based. And so I'll save a lot of money on airfare, and so that's why we're shooting.
Had you written it, so you didn't write it for LA necessarily?
I kind of wrote it for, I looked around, I read what the duties of parole officers were in a couple different places, and LA made sense with, that could happen. She could actually probably land a client who she knew personally and should have recused herself, and then decided, well, I need this woman's help now. I need somebody who has some street smarts.
Well, it's funny you mentioned that, because I wondered, why didn't she recuse herself early? What was your...
Well, she does say, I'm gonna get you somebody else, but then her son gets in trouble,
Right.
And then she just realizes, well, who can I go to?
But to you, when you were writing it, was it an ethical concern to you that she chose
Oh yeah,
not to?
yeah. I mean, she could get fired, very easily for what she just did, and she knows it. But it's her son, and she's a hard ass as a parole officer, because she's heard all, people hung these stories on her for years. The first person she talks to, she just says, sorry, honey, that's not going to cut it. You're in big trouble. And so all of a sudden now she has to realize, well, maybe there are such things as extenuating circumstances. And a lot of our clients, their whole life is an extenuating circumstance. There's always somebody who they shouldn't be associating who calls up, but it's their cousin. And my cousin did a couple of years, and so do I have to, not talk to anybody in my family? Just because I'm not supposed to hang out with other former criminals.
Yeah, the opening scene with the woman who gives her the whole story, and when she leaves, she says, "You're going to hear 5 of those a day."
Yeah.
Yeah, and you start to get immediately, you get into the head of what's the parole officer up against themselves.
Yeah.
You know, how many times are you going to hear that?
Lisa Gay Hamilton, who played the part, hung out with a parole officer for a day or two, you know, just to kind of get a hit on it. And she came back and she said, you know, they actually have to be in the room when they do the urine sample now. And I said, oh, that's great. You know, how embarrassing if a former best friend of yours is watching you urinate.
No, it was a very uncomfortable scene.
Yeah.
I never even thought of that as a...
Yeah, and that's what I've sunk to is I can't pee alone anymore.
Right.
You know, and I actually had not, when I had the first idea, I didn't know that they were going to be African American. They were just two actors I wanted to work with. Mm-hmm. And so I said, okay, I'd love to work with these people. Yolanda actually had come here. We did our auditions here for Honey Dripper, and she had come here to read for the part in Honey Dripper that Lisa Gay Hamilton got. And I, you know, as often happens when you meet a really cool actor you didn't know before, you write down, you know, not right for part, work with them sometime,
right.
You know, terrific actor. And so when that came up, you know, I just said, well, okay, that's who they are.
Yeah. Almost is so good, and I mean he's always good. That almost,
yeah.
But he does something I noticed. He doesn't make eye contact.
Yeah, it was interesting.
He looks away in this like completely divorced from other people
way,
but he isn't.
Macular degeneration you often can only see from the corners of your eyes. Mm-hmm. So he actually is looking at them. Mm. And I said, Daddy, okay, here's a couple websites that'll explain the disease to you. I knew a couple people who had it. It's up to you. You got to play this guy how severely affected he is yet, because it will deteriorate. And so he came, and the first scene that we shot was a scene where they hire him in this, I think it was a Salvadoran restaurant up in Van Nuys that we were shooting at. And I could see the two actresses at the table with him, and because they didn't know Eddie before this. And they're going like, you know, there's this look on their faces like, oh, this is weird. The movie star isn't looking at us. You know, and then they realize at the end of the scene, oh, fuck, he's blind. We hired a blind guy. Right. We just handed him thousands of dollars to be our detective. And he can't see when he tells them that, you know, oh, you'll do the driving. You know, and there's another nice scene with Jacobo Vargas where Eddie doesn't blink. Mm-hmm. And he just looks straight ahead, and this narco is walking around him and grilling him. And I realized, oh, what Eddie's doing is he's not going to show that he can't see, because that'll be a weakness.
Interesting, yeah.
You know, and so he just stonewalls the guy, like he's back doing Miami Vice, where he kind of scowled for 7 or 8 years. But he's just a wonderful actor, and he made all those nice movies with Bob Young, and they were kind of guerrilla filmmaking, and so he was thrilled when a motorcycle gang would ride through the middle of a scene or whatever. So he was like the perfect collaborator for that difficult a movie that you're shooting in 4 weeks.
And he was also a co-producer with you.
Yeah, you know, I mean, it's kind of like, okay, you know, anything we can get to help us have a little muscle when we try to sell this thing. It didn't help that much finally, but you know, and you know, he really he kind of just says, you know, once I got a little bit of traction, I just tell, you know, look, I'm going to take care of the performance. I'm not going to change lines, but I'm going to figure out who this guy is, you know. And so he really comes loaded for bear, and which is great. It's just when somebody inhabits a character that much, it's like, oh, what's it going to do today, you know? And you know, that's some of the fun of directing, obviously, when you get an actor like that, who's, you know, David Strathairn's another one, you know. I really, the first couple times I worked with David, because I knew him a little bit from college, and I had acted with him on stage. And I would be in a scene with Dave, and he's the only actor I've ever let act behind me, because, you know, before there was video assist, In the early days, you're acting, but you're also directing, and you want to see what the other people are doing, and you don't want to go, and
So you would intentionally stage things so you could.
So
see.
everybody was in front of me except for Dave, and I just say, Dave, do something interesting, And then you'd get in the editing room, and he'd be, that was really cool. I didn't know he was doing that.
The thing I find cool is when you don't see what they're doing on set, you see it in the dailies. And sometimes an actor, it's kind of a phenomenon. Certain actors read to me on film as opposed to on the set.
Well, that's the famous story that is told about Al Pacino in The Godfather, which is the studio wasn't that hot on Al Pacino. There were other people they would rather have played it. And when the early dailies came in, they were like all over Coppola saying, this guy's doing nothing. He's doing nothing. And then no, there's something there. I feel right about this guy. And then in the editing, when they started putting the scenes in order, it's a guy who freezes. Mm-hmm. By the end of the movie, he's a hard ass, look you in the eye and stab you in the back player. And he wasn't that at the beginning. And he was Coppola was busy, I'm sure, because the studio was on his back and he had Brando to deal with and all that. And I'm sure there must have been this incredible relief when he got into the editing room and he said, "Oh my God, he even did the arc for me."
He figured out the whole performance. And
he kept track of it when we're shooting way out of a sequence.
Well, I remember, and I'm blanking on who would have said this, but some director, and it made such an impression on me, said, you have to worry about 1,000 things. Mm. A good actor is just looking at what they're doing.
Yeah.
So sometimes you may have to say, you have to look at the bigger picture, but they also take a lot off your plate if they've really thought it through and if they're very creative. And
Joe Morton did that for me, in Brother from Another Planet. I just said, Joe, you don't have to remember any lines your character's view. So you've been cut a little bit of a slack there. But I'm going to be busy. I'm making this movie in 4 weeks in Harlem with... not that the crew was inexperienced, but we wanted to hire a lot of African Americans as heads of departments, so they were all 1 or 2 notches above what they had done before. And it was true guerrilla filmmaking. We only had $300,000 to make it,
which you had gotten from your
screenwriting. Yeah,
right.
Yeah, and so I said to Joe, "Look, I'm going to be busy. Ask me a question, but what this is about your character assimilating, and we're going to change how you dress, and by the end of the movie, you can kind of hang in this planet, you kind of know how to act, and you know how, pretty much how things are working here, and so you don't stick out like a sore thumb, and you're not going to get yourself in trouble, but at the beginning, you don't know anything, and you're not dressed like anybody, and whatever, and so there's a real art to this thing. You're going to have to keep track of that." And Joe did a brilliant job of that. And I would, every once in a while, he'd kind of say, "So where am I now?" And I'd say, "Well, remember this comes before that." "Okay, gotcha.
Hit were 19 and 20 in the southwest field and things was tough. The miners was trying to bring the Union to West Virginia, and the coal operators and their gun thugs was set on keeping them out. Them was hard people, your coal miners. Then they wasn't nobody who wanted to cross. So push come to shove, and pretty soon we had us a war down there in Mingo County, which in them days was known as Bloody Mingo. And that's where it all come to a head, there on Tug Fork, in the town of Matewan.
I have to ask you about Haskell Wexler. Mm-hmm. This is one of these cult figures, these fascinating people, and to me it's so interesting that you went from very bare bones and simple, and you're working with low budgets, and then you hire this guy, who not every director liked working with.
Hey,
a controversial
I'm one
artist.
of the few guys. I worked with him 4 times.
Yeah,
that's a record.
What led you to him? Why did you decide to hire Haskell Wexler?
We were riding down to West Virginia, and we were reading Maggie Can Read in the Car Without Getting Sick, and she was reading Masters of Light. And she read the Haskell Wexler chapter, which I had read. And she says, "We should hire this guy." And I had actually talked to Haskell. I hadn't met him. I had talked to him on the phone once. about a distributor, because his second movie, Latino, he needed a distributor for, and he said, well, what are these people like? So we had a nice conversation with him. And she said, we should hire this guy. And I said, well, yeah, he's like a big Hollywood cinematographer, but look at his politics. And the thing about Haskell is he cared about what the movie was about,
right,
which many cinematographers really don't.
Mate One is what we're talking about.
Yeah. And so I said, oh, well, worth a shot. Well, I think I have his phone number. And so we a couple days later, we get back to the Econo Lodge in Beckley, West Virginia, and the woman that does somebody named Hacksaw. He called. He said he was calling from his car, because Haskell always had the newest of. He was the first guy who'd have a phone in his car, and he said, "Whatever those people want, tell them the answer is yes." And so Haskell came, and it took a little getting adjusted, and I think it was useful that it was a very ambitious movie for the time that we had to shoot it. I think we had, once again, 6 or 7 weeks to shoot it, and we had to move around to get the period locations and stuff like that. So Haskell was fully engaged as a cinematographer, and he didn't think it was going to work. We're shooting the schedule, not the movie, and like almost every cinematographer I've ever worked with, he wants to make every shot with a beautiful intro and a beautiful outro. And I'm cutting in my head already. And I said, Haskell, that we don't need the beginning. Start here. Oh yeah, right, editing it, right. So basically, until he saw the movie, he came up to me and said, okay, you do know what you're doing. And then he said, I want to shoot your next movie. And this time I'm just going to do what you tell me. So we worked that out. But also he liked what the movie was about. And he liked the performances. And he felt like, okay, this could turn into something if he just listened to me more.
Did the presence of such a veteran change you as a director?
The great thing about Haskell is his speed to skill ratio was really great. He did not take a long time. And he understood, he shot documentaries for years. He understood, well, you do your best in the time that you've got. And he wasn't going to start painting if we didn't have time to do it. And I was very, very prepared. And I said, this is what we're going to shoot. Here's the angle. Here's the feeling I want from the light. You make that into light. And if you need more time, we'll pre-rig. Tell me when you're going to need more time to make it look cool, and we'll get your guys there earlier. So it didn't actually change it. I had worked with Michael Bauhaus already.
Right.
It was like his second movie he shot in America. The first one didn't get a nice little movie called Mr. Wonderful with Joe Pesci that never got a theatrical release. And Michael was another guy. He was the best operator I ever worked with. Wonderful guy and very fast and got you really good. So it actually didn't change. I actually went faster with these guys because they had war experience. Haskell brought some of his guys with him, but we actually had a mixed IA NABIT crew on Mate One. And Haskell was thrilled to do that. And eventually NABIT folded and those guys ended up in IA. But because he had some clout in the union at that point, he was able to have them agree, yes, we could use a wonderful gaffer who later became a shooter named Stefan Chapsky, and they had a good time working together. It actually didn't change. It was just like, oh, this could actually look really good.
So then that leads me to Honey Dripper, which is beautifully shot, and that's Dick Pope.
It's the last stand for Tyrone Purvis in the Honey Dripper Lounge.
Lucky, give me 2 weeks. Lucky, got a better offer. The chicken man, or the ice man, or the liquor man. Ah, damn. Ain't nobody gonna change your luck, Tyrone.
Can a guitar legend change his luck?
We playing here Saturday night.
Yeah? Everybody in town talking about Guitar Sam coming to Harmony.
Man, this joint is going to jump.
Guitar Sam get on this train? He's in the hospital back in Little Rock.
Hospital?
Or will a stranger,
That sounds like a good place for a musician.
with his own troubles,
You paying my way out?
Don't ask questions. I promised the people Guitar Sam, and they gonna get Guitar Sam.
change the world forever?
No, Ty.
It's important not to bite off more than you can chew.
It's your gig, man. This better be some Saturday night.
this is a film that I just love, and I've seen it a few
thanks.
times, and it's so very unusual. The first time I saw it, where I thought you were going was somewhere around the end of Act One. He was going to perform, and this was going to be about the transformation of.
Yeah, electric guitar comes to the rural South. Yeah.
But that's not what you're doing at all. You're doing a snapshot of a community over a few days in 1950 of an African American community. And once you kind of get into the pace of what you're doing and understanding, like that, really, this is like like I say, it's a snapshot of what that world was. So my first thought is, what led you to the South, to Alabama, to wanting to portray what those few days in 1950 might have been like, because that's what your film's really about.
Yeah, well, one of the things was there's this legendary rock, rhythm and blues story about Guitar Slim.
Yeah.
Guitar Slim had this one big hit, jukebox hit, The Things I Used to Do. But he was not so good at showing up for the gig. And so B.B. King, Albert King, a lot of these great axemen blues guys have been Guitar Slim, because he wouldn't show, and they were appearing somewhere else, or they were in a bar down the street. They said, nobody knows what the cat looks like. This is before rock videos and stuff like that. You know how to play the things I used to do. Well, you're him tonight.
Right.
So they all had stories about being Guitar Slim because he didn't show up. Steve Earle, I think, played Townes Van Zandt one night because Townes' book wasn't that well known then, and Townes didn't show up, and he knew all his stuff because they'd gig together.
Right.
So he said, "Well, there's a town somewhere in America where they think I am Townes Van Zandt." So I loved that story, and then I thought about that. Rhythm and blues had a very, very short time on stage. Ruth Brown was supposed to be in the movie and died before she got to be in it. And she had this.
She was going to be the blues singer at the beginning.
Yeah. And she had this. Atlantic Records was the house that Ruth built. She had like these hits, and then all of a sudden rock and roll came in and blew those people off the stage. So I was interested in that. So Danny Glover's character, he could have been a guy who was a great silent movie director, and all of a sudden the talkies come in, and can he hang with this new thing? And so in some ways, my interest was in those two phenomenon of somebody who is playing somebody else and does it so well that, oh my God, well, who's that? And then this other thing of a guy of a certain age having to realize, can I hang with this new thing, or am I going to be a guy who just stays back and said that's not music?
Right.
And some guys did and some guys didn't. Musically, there's this point. There's this point where Chuck Berry, his piano player, his name I think was Johnny Johnson. He was the guy doing the triplets and all this stuff. And Chuck Berry said, "Back off! I'm doing those on the guitar."
Right, and that's how that.
So the piano, Jerry Lee Lewis kind of accepted. All of a sudden, the piano and the saxophone kind of disappeared from rock and roll. It was pretty rare after the early 50s to have the piano or the saxophone have a dominant or even show up in a rock and roll song. So when Bruce Springsteen brings Clarence Clemens, it's like, oh wow, where'd that go? That's like really early rock and roll, or that's even rhythm and blues.
Right.
And it's cool.
It's so interesting too that he builds his own electric guitar. You don't think about the fact that the electric guitar was actually also a homemade thing that these guys heard. They heard that, but they were not going to afford it. Were they going to buy it?
Les Paul made one out of a fence post.
Yeah.
It's like you just need a piece of wood and then the electronics go on it. And people, one of the things that all these blues guys say is, well, the first song I ever played on the guitar was a Spanish Fandango, because that came with the Sears and Roebuck $4 guitar.
Oh, you got the music.
You got the music for a Spanish Fandango.
Yeah, there's a section of the movie, and I think it's when they're in the jail where he sings Midnight Special.
Yeah.
And for me, it's sort of a transformative moment, because that's when the music starts to take on. To me, it takes on more significance with the plot at that point, because you go from that to the knife fight, and then to the funeral, and suddenly the music becomes more
It's not just what they're performing.
Yes, exactly. Yeah,
it's telling you something about what's going on.
Yeah.
You know?
Yeah.
I mean, Midnight Special is a song from a guy in jail.
Yeah.
You know, and there's a bunch of those songs for a reason. Georgia, during the Depression, I think that's where Robert Mitchum did his time. If you hopped a freight in Georgia and you got caught, I was a fugitive from a chain gang. If you were lucky, you got off.
Right.
But Hank Williams, I'm in Georgia doing time. They pulled me off the Georgia train. Well, so to get around in those days, if you didn't have a ticket, you hopped a freight, and you had to really worry about ended up in jail. And if a crop was due for picking in the South, you had to, you were guilty of being black and unemployed. You likely got arrested, and so you didn't get paid for your work. Mm-hmm. So that was just the reality of the time, and I wanted the music to start to have that little bit of an undertone.
Yeah. How did you come to hire Dick Pope for that? It's a significantly, I feel like a different looking film.
Yeah, I had seen a bunch of Dick's work working for Mike Leigh, and what I knew about him was these all look different because Mike is trying to do something different here. So here's the guy who shot naked on really, really grainy 16 millimeter, and then he shot topsy-turvy.
Right.
Now this guy can hang. And so we were able to lure him over. He didn't get it to work with any crew that he knew, and so it was a tough job in that way. And it was, I eventually I shot the next one, Silver City on 16. I called Haskell Wexler up and said, "Hey, have you ever shot 16 millimeter?" And there was a little pause, and he said, me and two other guys invented that. As we realized we could ream out the gate and get more information, because he had shot so many industrials and stuff like that before he started shooting movies. But for Honey Dripper, I realized, I'm going to have dark-skinned people in front of white fields of cotton. I don't think 16's we're gonna be able to do it and not have it look really, that cotton's gonna be alive with the grain and stuff like that. So we bit the bullet and shot 35, even though it cost us, some money. And so really what I felt like I was getting with Dick is, obviously he's a guy who's made really low budget movies working with Mike. And then he's made bigger stuff. So I just said, Dick, do your best. Have this look as good as it possibly can. For the 5 weeks, we had 5 weeks. We had Danny Glover for 4 of them. So it was a tight, it's an ambitious movie for a 5-week movie.
Yeah, and again, it has that novelistic feel to it. You're getting the multiple stories. But again, because of the compressed time, I think that's one of the things I find so interesting about your script. Mm-hmm. So much happens. How many days, really, if you...
A lot happens, yeah. And one of the things is that when you have compressed time, there's, High Noon is the perfect example, or The Setup, where you keep going back to the clock, and it takes place in real time.
Setup does.
Yeah.
Yeah, The Setup literally is a 90-minute
and
story.
High Noon, there's that kind of ticking clock of, okay, the train's going to arrive, 3:10 to Yuma. Something's going to happen at 3:10,
right.
So when you have a finite amount of time, even Secaucus 7, I figured, well, okay, what's a 3-day weekend? They get there, they see each other, they interact, and then they have to go. So I've got 3 acts there. So with Honey Dripper, there's this show that has to happen, or else he's not going to be able to cover the rent, and he's going to lose his place. So we've got some time tension here, mm-hmm. So it helps focus what's kind of an amorphous story of a lot of people.
Right. Yeah, like I say, I think of it as a snapshot of that community. When I went to Greenwood, Mississippi, and I started meeting the people who a lot of them were alive and living in the.
Yeah.
The presence of the police was still fresh in their head, and
Yeah.
they would talk to me about how absolutely powerless they were.
Yeah.
You write that so convincingly, but an interesting thing happens with the sheriff in Honey Dripper. He kind of becomes, I wouldn't call him a hero, but he's not such a bad guy at the end.
What do you?
And it's a bit of a tightrope.
What you see and what happened in a lot of the community is he's paternalistic.
Mm-hmm.
So they're not in the civil rights movement yet. So he's not busting their balls yet and busting their heads with a club and shooting people and all that kind of stuff. It's still, well, these are my people too.
Right.
And I'm their sheriff too. And they all know me. And we have worked something out, these club owners and I. And, you know, so he's like the benevolent version of Chris Christopherson.
Exactly, yeah.
And Lone Star. Not exactly benevolent, but you can live with him.
Do you think he was the version of, is he Buddy Deeds? In a sense, like if you really dramatize Buddy Deeds from Lone Star.
He's the get-along sheriff.
Right.
You know, and if you go along, you know, he's okay. You know, and he likes fried chicken, and he likes the music, and he thinks the people are entertaining and colorful, and he gets to call them by their first names, and they call him Mr. or Sheriff or whatever. And so, as long as you know what the deal is, it's not a huge problem.
Which is a nuanced version of that.
And it was wonderful to get Stacy Keach, who's an actor I've always loved, to finally get to work with him. Mm-hmm. And once again, I didn't know what he was going to do with it. And it was just the first day, it was like, oh, great, this is going to be really fun.
Right. What was the last time you shot film? 35 or 16?
I think it might have been, Silver City, which we shot in 16, yeah. Mm-hmm. And then kind of what happened is just, we started doing the numbers. The first thing that happened is I had to stop editing on film. And I think the Coen brothers and I were the last people on the East Coast to edit on film. Mm-hmm. And I think what happened to them is 9/11, their editing room was down near there, and the ceiling fell in on their great big 8-plate. That looked like the bridge of the Starship Enterprise. And I just couldn't get people to fix the machine anymore because we were editing upstate where I lived in Dutchess County. And they just said, we're not really doing that anymore. And so, I kind of learned how to do digital editing. I like it. I figure out, because I usually have assistants when I shot on film who did certain things for me, but I put the reels up. You put the reels up and take them down on an 8-plate X number of times a day, that's about an hour of time you save with digital.
And a good aerobic workout.
The thing that I miss is that when you were rolling, even fast forwarding back and forth on your reels, you saw stuff. Whereas when you could just push a button and go exactly to the spot, you don't necessarily see the stuff. So you actually have to take a little more dedicated time to look at takes that you maybe have just dismissed before. And, there's something good there. There's a cutaway there.
Do you assemble while you're shooting? Or do you wait till you're done?
No, I have my assistant editor take the last full take of every angle, and that's the dailies that we watch, and we often show them to the cast and crew who want to come on location or whatever. But I don't even take notes during it. I know the stuff so well. I'm editing in my head, so it's kind of like, oh yeah, I remember this. Yeah, I like this take. I barely even look at the notes that my script supervisor takes. I just zip through.
I feel like the script supervisor job has become a lot less exacting. It's the last couple times I've worked, they're kind of not watching the continuity that much anymore. I kind of don't mind, but it's different than from when I started, though.
I started before Video Assist, and so they really had to be on their game then, or else you're going to have mistakes all throughout when there was no way to check. But I work with Mary Sobalski a lot, who was kind of like the standard bearer for script supervisors on the East Coast, and she worked with all these great people, and I really relied on her as I've got a shitload to shoot today. I'm in the double J's. We've got that many angles, and I know I'm not going to get them all. So at some point, I'm going to turn to you and say, we've got an hour left, how do I get out of this?
Yeah, what do I need?
And Mary would be drawing pictures, and I said, well, we could go from this to this, and we could drop 2 shots there and stuff like that. So I really relied on good experienced script supervisors a lot. I've had movies, on my last movie, quite honestly, the script supervisor got the job because on her resume, she said she could drive a truck and lift 200 pounds. And so as a script supervisor, she could drive a truck, and she really never quite got Eyeline.
Yeah.
You know, she was a beginner, and she was a great crew person, but I didn't rely on her for any script supervisors.
Well, where I find it becomes most glaring is older actors are used to saying, where was my prop and what line did I say? And a lot of the time it just draws a blank.
Yeah,
they don't quite know what to say because they're not really following it that closely anymore.
I really give them that lecture of, you're going to have to help these people out because we're not going to do that many takes.
Right.
I also do an awful lot of handicapping the scene so that if there's a lot of business, if it's a lot of people, for instance, I have a scene in Go for Sisters where I've got 6 or 7 actresses at a table eating and drinking, and they're not going to act. I eventually said, one of you suckers has got to actually swallow some food,
right.
On camera. But I would just try to say, okay, look, I got a lot of cutaways here. Don't worry about your continuity. If you have a drink and you start to drink it, we'll note that, but don't worry about it.
But I also think that part of that is that the vocabulary of editing and continuity has changed. I don't think the audience is that necessarily wrapped up if they're interested in what's going on. There's always going to be someone on IMDb who tells you there's a goof.
Yeah, well,
but aside from that,
if they've been watching TV and they watch the CSI show, there's no eyeline anymore.
Right.
The camera's always moving. The eyeline's all over the place. I watched one episode where I had met Gary Sinise when I worked on Apollo 13, and there's a lab montage where they're doing the forensics, and I realized they just shot this in one day, and it's used for every episode in the series.
Right.
And it's Gary's in the lab coat, and he's looking down, and he's nodding his head, and it's look right, Gary, look left, Gary,
Right.
And it's perfect for the editor, and it fits any lab scene.
Do you mind that?
To me, it lacks a certain focus, and to a certain extent, I'm very aware of a lot of TV shows are about stimulation, not storytelling. So I remember my friend David Strathairn was in a not very good science fiction series for a couple seasons, and whenever there was an action scene, they would just play heavy metal loud. It wasn't scored. It was just stimulation.
Right.
And the cutting was just stimulation. And there was that thing for a while where they would do that little jerk on every cut, and the operator wasn't doing it. They were doing that in post. What's her name did it in the Hurt Locker, and it just drove me crazy.
Right.
I come on. I don't need to be jolted by an electrical current every time you cut. But it got to be a thing for a while. So yeah, some of it is just annoying to me because I'm more interested in the characters and the story rather than being stimulated all the time.
Mm-hmm.
I can hook a low voltage battery up to myself and hit a button if I.
I just wanted. This has been so cool, and I really could do this for hours. I'm not going to because you're a busy guy.
Yeah.
But I do want to just ask you one last thing. When I saw you last, it was at Jonathan Demme's memorial at the DGA, and we were talking about how Jonathan Demme once told you that he wished he could work in the studio system. And I think what you told me was you doubted he would fit naturally, that it was sort of, and I always think about the studio system of yore, that it may not have necessarily been quite as choked with restrictions, because people were able to be employed so much and could work so much. So I was thinking about your work. Now, this may sound completely strange, given that you're an icon of independent cinema, but I wonder if you ever thought, would you fit, if it had been, if you were born 30 years earlier, would you have possibly found a fit in the studio system? And here's why I say it. You are a prolific writer. That was very important then. You're an efficient director. Very important. Comfortable and with actors. Also important because they were plugging actors in who had to get along with around the era of Billy Wilder, Preston Sturges, John Huston, the writer-director hyphenate comes to the studio system. And you have, seemingly to me, limitless energy to continue producing. It's kind of it may be specious. I just wonder sometimes if you ever think about that.
I think I would have been Sam Fuller and been fine up to a certain point, and then they just said go away. Which was too bad because he was still capable of making good movies.
Yeah.
And what you see with Sam Fuller's stuff, he was very efficient. He didn't do a lot of takes. He knew what he was doing. He knew what he wanted. He wrote his own stuff. It had a lot of bam to it, a lot of snap to it. But he purposely didn't shoot coverage so they couldn't recut him because you didn't get to cut your own movies back there, kind of like TV now. So you watch some of Sam's black and white war movies and it gets grainy all of a sudden. And it's like Sam shot a master shot and he realized he needed a close-up. And so, that guy was a third of the frame and he's blown it up that much to get the, I remember when they were shooting The Big Red One, and Louis Teague, who shot a couple movies that I wrote, had been hired by Gene Corman, Roger's brother, who was one of the producers on that, to shoot Second Unit. But it was basically to shoot coverage on Sam. And Sam kind of said to Louis, okay, kid, stay out of my way. But there's a lot of, because Sam handed in something like a 3.5, 4 hour epic, there's a lot of Lewis's stuff in there. So it was Lewis who got a shot of a guy's watch, a dead guy floating as the waves come in, so they could cut down Sam's, amphibious invasion, which was probably, like Spielberg, and went on for 20 minutes, and they cut it down to 5, using Lewis's stuff. So I think that's who I would have been. I probably wouldn't have gotten to the John Huston level. I would have been working in genre and trying to do something interesting with genre.
Comfortable in the B side as some of
because
the
they leave you
greatest
alone.
were. Bud Bedecker, Don Siegel.
The great thing working with Roger Corman is if you were the B movie, he didn't even come to the set because he was bothering the people on the A movie, and kind of looking at the time and the stuff like that. The B movie, as long as you didn't go over time and budget, you got left alone. And you just dealt with, I wrote this movie, the Lady in Red, that Lewis directed, and I get this call. I hadn't met Lewis before, and he said, I've got $750,000 to make this epic this period epic that you've written set in Chicago in 1931 in LA. Help. And I came and I cut some stuff down. I probably cut 15 pages out of it. And still he had to tear pages out of the script. So there's some gaps in the movie just to get it made. I think I could have maybe hung on in that, but I was telling a story about Elliot Azanoff, who wrote the book 8 Men Out. I think it was Walter Bernstein, who, when he got blacklisted, he was buddies with Elliot, and Elliot hadn't been blacklisted yet. And he said, would you front for me? Would you go in and say you wrote the script and deal with the stuff? And Elliot was such a cantankerous guy that he'd start arguing with the producers and get fired. So finally, his days were as a front.
The opportunity entirely.
Just agree with them. Just agree with them. I need the dough.
So yes, so you don't feel like you missed a chance in that world.
No, having the work is nice, but I think it would have, for a lot of guys, it was like just being in a stable of TV directors, and they're going to throw another Gunsmoke at you, and these are the rules for shooting. I have friends who worked in soap operas, and the soap opera crews would let you hang yourself the first day, and you wouldn't make your day, and then they'd take you aside and say, "Here's what we do. These are your angles."
Right.
And I'm afraid an awful lot of directors who worked in Hollywood, that was it. Here are your angles, and how come you didn't shoot a master? And you had to have some successes or be working really low budget before you got away with not shooting a master.
Right. Well, it's also, I think, the way I've shadowed on an episodic show, and I thought I wanted to try to do that, and I really don't want to do it. Because what you're doing is essentially what you're saying. You're hosing it down. Master, medium, over, close.
If I ever worked in TV,
and I don't. It's a session music. You're a session musician essentially, and I respect those guys a lot because they're okay with getting their heads into the genre of the show they're doing. But I don't know that I have the equipment for it.
If I ever work in TV, I'll just say, look, guys, I'm not going to go over. I'm not going to go into overtime. But I'm not shooting that. I'm not hosing it down.
Right.
I'm going to actually do this in master shots. And we won't shoot until after lunch. Our movie City of Hope. There's 8 or 9 master shots that are at least 5 minutes long. Some of them are 9 minutes long, and we were still working on film with 10-minute reels. And so, you just work it out, and then you'd shoot until you had 2 keepers. And, when I cut that movie in like 7 weeks instead of 10, because you pick the take you like, you cut the slates off
right?
and go to the beach. I just cut 8 minutes in a day, So yeah, there's other ways to work, but you have to, the people have to know and allow you to do that. I thought the most brilliant kind of plan for, a TV show was, what was the one with Duchovny?
X-Files?
X-Files.
Yeah.
They're working in government offices and they've got one bare light bulb. The lighting on that was like, John Alton, one source, harsh, hard lighting, but the whole show looked like that. And it's really cheap and it's really fast. And it looks great. Beautiful concept.
And that was where I think Eddie Dmytryk used to say film noir was invented, because you didn't have to light. It was shadow. It was quick. All those movies were 20 days.
What's the nice? It's a Clint Eastwood movie that's kind of based on Shane, and it's the guy who comes to the town and.
Oh, Unforgiven.
No, not Unforgiven. It's the earlier one. All the guys in dusters come to blow him away at the end, and it's a nice movie. But Henry Bumstead, who used to be his production manager for years and years and years, the way they were shooting it, I forget if Surtees shot. I think Surtees might have shot it. In the interiors, they're just letting. You can see what's happening outside, so they could have Playboy posters on the walls on the interior. They're so dark, and only if the guy goes over to them, kind of, okay, that's probably what it was like if you didn't turn a light on in there. And it works for that movie. So you if you can find a low budget thing that's also a style, that's terrific.
Yeah. When and where is the Western that you want to do set?
It actually takes place in New Mexico in territory in 1898. So it's a chase, and one of the characters that Chris Cooper would play is Pat Garrett 17 years after he shot Billy the Kid, and he's just put the badge on again. So we were going to shoot in some of the actual places in New Mexico, but we just can't afford. So we scouted down in Durango, and there's a set there still, even though they had a fire a couple of years ago, that's still partially standing, that used to belong to John Wayne. And a lot of Westerns used to be shot in Durango, Mexico. And it looks enough like,
So you would go to Mexico again?
We'd go down there and work with an all-Mexican crew. And I speak enough Spanish to direct a movie in Mexican.
Well, directed whole movies in Spanish.
Yeah. I mean, the first thing I learned in Spanish, my Spanish is okay, it's not great, but it's okay, was the difference between vamos a hacer una otra toma, which means we're going to do another take, and vamos a tomar, which is let's go have a drink. When the crew is cheering and you're only halfway through the day, really, what did I just say?
If you enjoyed listening to Movies Till Dawn, I'd love to hear from you. You can email me at moviestilldawnpodcast@gmail.com. You can access these conversations at iTunes, Spotify, TuneIn, Stitcher, Google Podcasts, SoundCloud, YouTube, as well as our website, moviestilldawn.transistor.fm. If you'd like to see some videos pertaining to the guests of each episode, please visit my blog at moviestilldawn.blogspot.com. And please feel free to follow me on Twitter at ReelRDEF. That's ReelRDEF. All interview material and audio clips are covered by the Fair Use Copyright Act of 1976, in which allowance is made for fair use for purposes such as criticism, comment, news reporting, teaching, scholarship, education, and research.